Picture this. It's a normal Tuesday night. Mark Grayson is dragging the trash to the curb. He's 17 years old and he's complaining to himself the whole walk over, because that's just what you do when you're 17 and your dad somehow always disappears right before chores. Like, he grabs the trash can, yanks it off the ground, and nearly launches it into orbit. That one moment at a trash can is the entire reason the show exists. Mark has his powers. His life is about to completely change. Everything that comes after, every fight, every villain, every world-altering secret, it all starts right there. But Mark was 17 when that happened. He'd spent his whole life just being a kid, a normal kind of dorky, homework doing, friend having kid. He got to do that first. He got to figure out who he was before the powers showed up and complicated everything. So what happens if that timing shifts? What if the trash can moment isn't 17-year-old Mark fumbling through a chore, but 7-year-old Mark having a tantrum and accidentally putting his fist through the kitchen wall? What if the powers came a whole decade earlier? It actually changes almost everything about this show. Every major relationship Mark has, which with his dad, with his friends, with the people he's fighting and the people he's protecting, all of it runs through the question of when he became invincible. Here's the premise. We're saying Mark Grayson's Viltrumite powers activate somewhere between age 7 and 10. That means super strength, near invulnerability, and eventually flight, the whole package, just showing up years earlier than it does in the show. For those who need a quick refresh, Mark's dad is Nolan Grayson, better known as Omni-Man, who the world believes is a heroic alien from a dying planet called Viltrum. That's not true. Nolan is actually a sleeper agent. His real mission is to weaken Earth's defenses so the Viltrumite Empire can absorb it. Mark is his half-human son, and from the very beginning, Nolan always expected Mark to develop powers at some point. He just didn't know when. In the show, the timing is almost lucky. Mark spends 17 years being completely human. He builds friendships. He develops empathy. He grows into someone who genuinely cares about people. And then the powers show up, and all of that is already baked in. It's already part of how he is. Thus, the show is really running two storylines at the same time. There's Mark becoming a hero, like figuring out what he stands for, what he'll protect, what kind of person he wants to be. And then there's Nolan slowly cracking under the weight of a mission. He can't quite bring himself to complete, because somewhere along the way, Earth stopped being a target and started being home. Those two tracks are perfectly timed to collide right around Mark's 17th birthday. I'll pull that timing apart, and both tracks go sideways. That's what we're exploring today. For this analysis, we're working from the animated series seasons 1 through 3 only. The comics go in very different directions, and since this is a what if, we're going to be honest when we're speculating. We're not going to present guesses as facts. When something isn't confirmed in the show, we'll say so. In the show, when Mark gets his powers, Nolan already has a plan. He knows what to do. He tests Mark casually, like a sparring session, a little controlled flight. And there's this quiet satisfaction in how Nolan handles it. He's been waiting 17 years for this moment, and now the clock can finally start. But a 7-year-old doesn't give you that kind of grace period. Kids that age aren't subtle. They're not managing their tells. If Mark develops super strength at age 8, it doesn't stay hidden for long. It comes out in an accident, a hug that leaves a bruise, a ball thrown way too hard in the backyard, a bad dream where he rolls over and flips the bed frame across the room. Nolan finds out fast, and that changes his entire position. Here's the thing about Nolan in the show that's easy to miss until you go back and rewatch it. By the time Mark gets his powers at 17, Nolan has been on Earth for 20 years. He loves Debbie. He has a real life, a real home, real habits. The mission is still in there. It never fully left, but it's buried under 2 decades of just being a dad, being a husband, being a person. His emotional connection to Earth didn't happen all at once. It built up slowly, one ordinary moment at a time. So the question with early powers isn't just logistical, it's emotional. If Nolan finds out his son is powered at age 8, what does that do to him? Does having a Viltrumite heir in the house make him more focused on the mission, more committed, because now the plan can actually move, or does it do the opposite? Does it force the conflict inside him to surface 10 years sooner than the show allows? Honestly, probably both. And that tension is exactly what makes this version of the story interesting. Because on one hand, Nolan is a Viltrumite warrior. Finding out his son carries the bloodline, like that Mark is genuinely powerful. Like, that's validating in a deep cultural way. In Viltrumite society, strength is everything. An early powered child isn't a problem to manage. It's a source of pride. But on the other hand, that powered child is also half human. He goes to school with human kids. He has a human mother he loves. He's not just some Viltrumite heir. He's Mark. And watching Mark be kind and funny and awkward and genuinely caring about people for a decade more than the show allows is a decade more of Nolan being reminded of what's actually at stake. The training starts early. In the show, Nolan's approach to training Mark feels almost casual, like dad and son coaching sessions that happen to involve punching through brick walls. It's warm, there's humor in it, but training an 8-year-old is a different thing entirely. It has to be structured, it has to be secretive, and with that structure comes ideology. Nolan would almost certainly start teaching Mark about Viltrumite values much earlier, not in a lecture format, more woven into training. You're stronger than everyone around you, you're built differently, we're built to endure what others can't. Does Mark absorb that? Maybe some of it, but he's also going to school every day, watching humans struggle and laugh and help each other. He's got a mom who's the most grounded person in his life. The Viltrumite worldview is going to hit some real friction pretty early. Then there's Debbie. In the show, she's completely in the dark until the truth devastates her in season 1. But if Mark has powers at age 8, if there are accidents, if there's training, if Nolan has to explain to his son why they can't tell anyone, can Debbie really be kept out of it for another decade? Does Nolan loop her in? Does he tell her some version of the truth? Not the mission, but at least the powers? If Debbie knows early, even just the powers part, not the mission, that changes her role significantly. She becomes a stabilizing force in Mark's training years. Someone who can push back against Nolan's ideology without even knowing there is an ideology, just by being herself. And then there's Cecil. Cecil Stedman, head of the Global Defense Agency, is watching everything. The GDA monitors superhero activity. A powered 8-year-old who is the son of Omni-Man is not something Cecil is going to miss forever. Does he make contact earlier? Does he try to bring Mark into some kind of program? Whatever Cecil's move is, it happens earlier in this version. And the whole dynamic between him and Mark, that tense, transactional, I'm using you, but I kind of respect you relationship, starts forming before Mark is emotionally ready for it. Alright, let's talk about what Mark actually has going into everything. He's got a best friend in William Clockwell, someone who knew him before any of this, who likes him for completely non-superhero reasons. He's got normal school drama, a job at a burger place, a crush he doesn't know how to talk to. He's funny and a little dorky, and he knows how to be around people. None of that feels like a big deal, but all of it matters. Mark is emotionally functional, and a huge part of that is because he got to just be a kid first, unguarded, unpressured, just Mark. Take that away and you're working with a very different person. If Mark is powered at 7 or 8, he cannot go to a normal school without enormous risk. This isn't a teenager who can mostly keep it together. This is a child who hasn't developed impulse control yet. One bad day on the playground, one shove at recess, one moment of fear or frustration in a crowded classroom, someone ends up seriously hurt. Nolan knows this. So the early years probably involve a lot of controlled behavior rules. You don't use your strength ever. Not for anything. Not even to open a stuck jar. You are always careful. You are always holding back. You pretend to be something you're not every single day, and you do it perfectly because the alternative is unthinkable. Imagine growing up with that as your baseline. Not as a teenager who's had 17 years of normal first, as a little kid where this is just the condition of your existence. The homeschooling question comes up pretty quickly. Nolan might pull Mark out of regular school during the early training years, at least partially, or he enrolls him, but with a very strict behavioral agreement. Rules Mark has to follow every hour of every school day. Either way, the social isolation is real, and here's where one of the clearest losses in this scenario shows up. The friendship with William. In the show, William and Mark meet as normal kids. Their friendship is built on just liking each other, jokes, shared interests, hanging out, being teenagers. William is one of Mark's most important human anchors throughout the series. He keeps Mark tethered to the ordinary world even when everything else is going sideways. In this version, that friendship either doesn't happen or forms under completely different conditions. A Mark who's been trained to hide what he is, who can't fully relax around anyone, who's been carrying a secret since he was old enough to throw a car. That kid meets William very differently. Maybe they're still friends, but there's always a wall up. There's always something Mark isn't saying. And that changes the whole texture of the relationship. The identity question runs even deeper. And in the show, Mark chooses the name Invincible himself. He picks the costume, he decides to be a hero, he makes that call against his dad's initial hesitation. It's his. The choice belongs to him completely. In the early Powers version, who chose his identity? After a decade of Nolan's training and Nolan's framing of what Mark is and what he's capable of, is Invincible a name Mark picks for himself, or is it a name he was always being shaped to wear? That's a subtle difference on the surface. Underneath, it's a huge one. Think about the irony here. In the show, Nolan is frustrated that Mark's humanity slows his development. Mark feels things too much, he hesitates, he worries about collateral damage, he asks questions. Nolan sees that as weakness. But in this scenario, Nolan gets the opposite of what he thought he wanted. He gets a son who's been raised with powers from the start. But what he actually produces is a kid who's been living a double life since second grade, who's been managing a secret so big that it colors every relationship he has. Who knows he's different in a way that can never really be explained or shared. That's not a more loyal Viltrumite. That might be a more confused, more isolated, more guarded one, and underneath all of that, probably angrier. In the show, Mark's anger is understandable, but it's also bounded. He has enough normal life to give it perspective. Early powered Mark's anger doesn't have that same check. He's been holding back since he was a little kid, and that kind of pressure finds a way out eventually. Okay, so let's zoom out and look at the bigger picture, because the show's central tension isn't really about Mark at all, or at least it's not only about Mark. It's about Nolan. It's about a Viltrumite warrior who came to Earth with a mission, spent decades here, and slowly became someone who couldn't complete it. In the show, Nolan's mission is to weaken Earth's defenses, to dismantle its heroes, to make the planet ready for Viltrumite conquest. He kills the original Guardians of the Globe in Season 1, his own allies, people who trusted him, and it's one of the most shocking moments in the entire series. That's how committed he is, at least at that point. On paper, early power Mark makes the mission easier. A trained, powered teenage Mark alongside Nolan is a completely different threat level than what we see in Season 1. The Guardians, impressive as they are, aren't built to handle two Viltrumites working together. So strategically, early powers look like an asset for the mission. Nolan has a decade of extra training time. Mark is more capable by the time the show's major events happen. The whole plan should be further along, but here's the wrinkle that makes this so interesting. Nolan's emotional timeline probably moves too. In the show, those 20 years between arriving on Earth and Mark getting his powers are the years that broke Nolan's commitment to the mission. Not all at once. Gradually, quietly, he built a life. He fell in love. He had a kid who looked up to him. He saved people not because the mission required it, but because somewhere in there he stopped wanting them to die. Now imagine that same emotional erosion happening while Mark is powered and in active training. For 10 years, Nolan is watching his Viltrumite son grow up, making human friends and crying over movies and defending kids at school who can't defend themselves. He's watching Mark choose kindness over and over again in 100 small ways. And every time Mark makes that choice, like every time Mark is more human than Viltrumite, Nolan is reminded of exactly what the mission is asking him to destroy. The conflict that cracks Nolan open in season 1 might start cracking him open in season 1, equivalent minus 10 years. His breaking point arrives earlier, which raises the big question about the Guardians massacre. Does it still happen? Does it happen sooner? Does Nolan try to involve Mark? In the show, Nolan very deliberately kept Mark out of it. Even at the moment of action, even when he's willing to murder his oldest allies, he doesn't bring his son into that room. That choice says a lot. Even at his most mission-driven, Nolan is protecting Mark from something, whether that's protecting Mark's innocence or protecting the mission from Mark's conscience, or both. It's a meaningful line he doesn't cross. After a decade of training together, does that change? Does Nolan still want to keep Mark away from that moment, or does he see Mark by now as a soldier rather than a son? The show's DNA suggests the protectiveness never fully goes away, but 10 more years of training might blur that line in uncomfortable ways. And then there's the fight. The season 1 confrontation between Nolan and Mark is the emotional engine of the entire series. Nolan beats Mark within an inch of his life, and then he stops. He can't finish it. He flies away and leaves Mark bleeding on the ground. That moment is devastating, but it's also the moment Nolan finally breaks. Whatever he tells himself about the mission, he cannot kill his son. That's where the show draws its line. In this version, that fight is different. Mark has been training for 10 years. He's not a rookie walking into something he doesn't understand. He's been conditioning against someone who is genuinely one of the most powerful beings on the planet. He's logged real combat experience. He's significantly stronger than he was in the show's version of this fight. Does Nolan still win? Almost certainly yes. Nolan's ceiling is just genuinely higher. This is established across the whole show, but the fight is closer, and a closer fight changes the emotional math. Maybe Nolan hesitates earlier because Mark is holding his own. Maybe the fact that Mark can actually challenge him makes Nolan pull back sooner. That could mean less damage, less trauma, a version of this confrontation that's still brutal, but not quite as devastating. Or suckers, and this is the darker reading, a more dangerous Mark means Nolan has to go harder to stop him. A closer fight that Nolan is actually worried about losing might push him to be more ruthless, not less. The emotional breaking point might come at exactly the same moment, but the wreckage on either side of it might be worse. Either way, Nolan's departure at the end of season 1 is probably still the same. He leaves. He can't complete the mission. He can't kill his son, but the version of him that leaves might be more fractured yellow bite because he's been fighting that internal battle for 10 years instead of 1. Here's the general rule for this section. A Mark who's been powered and trained since age 7 arrives at the show's villain encounters with a lot more experience. He's not a rookie. He's been doing this for nearly a decade by the time he's facing most of these threats. That changes outcomes, but not always in the ways you'd expect. More prepared doesn't automatically mean better. Sometimes it means the drama disappears, and the drama is kind of the point. Mark's early fights in the show are genuinely rough. He makes mistakes. He gets hit harder than he expects. He figures things out on the fly with a mix of instinct and stubbornness. Or that's the point. He's learning in real time, and the show uses those stumbles to tell us who he is. In the early powered version, those fights are cleaner. The Mahler twins, the first Flaxen invasion, the early GDA work, he handles all of it more efficiently. He's already made his rookie mistakes in training, not in the field. That's a net positive for saving lives, obviously, but it removes one of the key mechanisms the show uses to make Mark human and relatable. Watching him struggle is how we connect with him. And there's also a Cecil angle here. In the show, Cecil recruits Mark partly because Mark needs guidance and resources. Cecil's leverage over Mark is rooted in Mark's inexperience. He can offer things Mark actually needs. A Mark who arrives already capable and polished is harder to get hooks into. Cecil's hold on him weakens, which might actually sound like a good thing right up until you realize that Cecil's involvement, as complicated and morally gray as it is, also keeps Mark grounded in the GDA's infrastructure and gives him access to information he'd otherwise be missing. Levy's arc is one of the most thematically rich villain stories in the whole show. Before the accident, he was a pacifist who genuinely wanted to use his dimensional powers to save lives, absorbing the memories and knowledge of his alternate selves across the multiverse to build a kind of living library of solutions. What he ends up with instead is a mind full of competing, scrambled memories, many of which include timelines where Omni-Man and Invincible devastated entire worlds. He blames Mark for the explosion that caused all of it, and that blame, filtered through thousands of traumatic alternate universe memories, becomes something genuinely unhinged. Here's the interesting wrinkle with Levy in this scenario. A more powerful, more experienced Mark might actually cause more collateral damage in his early career, not less. Confidence at 17 after a decade of training could lead to overreach, taking on bigger threats before fully understanding the limits of his own power, moving fast and hitting hard because that's what training taught him. Precision comes with experience, but overconfidence is its own kind of problem. If Mark's early career is messier in different ways, like not inexperienced but overreaching, then Levy's collection of alternate universe memories might paint an even uglier picture of what Invincible is capable of, not better. The texture of Mark's failures changes, and that feeds into Levy differently. The Levy fight itself is one of Mark's most brutal and personal confrontations in the show. A more trained Mark probably ends it faster, but if Levy never reaches his full threat level because Mark shuts it down too early, well, you lose one of the story's most emotionally complicated villain arcs. That's a trade-off worth naming. Conquest is where this scenario gets really interesting. He's the Viltrumite Empire's enforcer, their nuclear option, deployed when other approaches have failed. By the time Conquest arrives in Season 3, the Empire has already sent Anissa to check on Mark's progress and give him a final warning. Conquest showing up means that warning has been ignored. His mission isn't really to assess whether Mark is Viltrumite enough on some philosophical level, it's to give him one last chance to fall in line and to make clear what happens if he doesn't. If Mark has been powered since childhood, the Viltrumite Empire probably knows about him earlier. Nolan's mission failure and his departure from Earth at the end of Season 1 is clearly what triggers Empire attention in Seasons 2 and 3 of the show. Change the timeline and that attention might arrive sooner, but the more interesting question about Conquest isn't timing, it's ideology. A Mark who's been raised with at least some exposure to Viltrumite values, even the watered down version Nolan would have given him, might respond to Conquest differently than show Mark does. Not as an ally, not even close, but maybe with more complicated feelings than outright rejection. Show Mark's relationship with his Viltrumite heritage is almost entirely filtered through the horror of finding out what Nolan really is. He never had a chance to engage with it on its own terms before it was poisoned. Early powered Mark has lived alongside that heritage for years. He knows the training, the discipline, the physical identity of being Viltrumite. That doesn't make him sympathetic to the Empire, but it might make the confrontation with Conquest messier, more internal, less clean. Thrag is the apex of what Viltrumites are. He's not just physically stronger than almost anyone, he's the ideological embodiment of everything the Empire represents. Fighting Thrag isn't really a physical challenge as much as it is a statement about what Mark stands for. The show builds toward Thrag over multiple seasons because Mark needs to grow into someone capable of facing not just the fight, but what the fight means. It takes time, it takes loss, it takes Mark becoming fully himself. In this scenario, Mark might reach physical readiness earlier. The training advantage is real, but Thrag's threat isn't primarily physical. It's political, it's ideological, it's about the future of the Viltrumite species and what Earth's place in that future is. A Mark who was raised under Nolan's controlled influence might actually be less equipped for that dimension of the conflict. He's trained to fight, he hasn't been given the full picture of what he's fighting against. Nolan managed his exposure, gave him the strength without the full context, and you can't fight Thrag without understanding what Thrag represents. Harren, in a weird way, Showmark's late start might actually be an advantage here. He comes to the Thrag conflict with no illusions. He knows exactly what the Viltrumite Empire is because he learned it the hardest possible way. That clarity is part of what makes him capable of facing it. Let's get direct about this. Is early powered Mark actually better off? Is he stronger, more capable, more dangerous by the time the show's major events hit physically? Almost certainly yes. The show establishes that Viltrumite biology responds to stress and combat experience. A decade of training under Nolan, someone whose power level is essentially off the charts, means Mark has been stress testing his body and his limits since he was a child. By 17, he's logged far more conditioning than Show Mark has. He hits harder, he takes hits better, he's more efficient in a fight. And so like, dude, that part is pretty clear cut. But here's the thing. Physical capability is only half of what makes Mark Grayson dangerous. The other half is who he is as a person. Show Mark is emotionally functional in a way that's actually kind of remarkable given everything he goes through. He has empathy because he spent 17 years developing it among people who couldn't fly or punch through walls. He was just a person experiencing things the way people experience them. He learned what it means to be hurt, to be afraid, to need help, to give it. That didn't come from training, it came from just living. He's warm, he's funny, he makes friends easily, he's loyal in ways that feel genuine rather than programmed. Those aren't small things. They're central to everything that makes Invincible a hero rather than just a weapon. Early powered Mark has been holding back for a decade. He's been different since he was old enough to understand what different means, and that kind of long-term concealment and double life tends to go one of two ways. Route A, Mark internalizes the secrecy as a kind of low-grade shame. He develops a fractured sense of self. The real him and the version he shows the world are never quite the same thing. He becomes harder to read, more guarded, more likely to blow up under pressure in ways that seem to come out of nowhere, because the pressure has actually been building for years. Route B, Mark finds his footing. He processes it, probably through whatever human connections he manages to build despite the isolation. He becomes more self-aware than Show Mark, more controlled, more intentional because he's had to be for a long time. The secrecy doesn't break him, it forges him. The show's overall DNA pushes toward Route A, honestly. Mark's emotional volatility is a running thread throughout all 3 seasons. When he breaks hard. Extend the pressure cooker by a decade, and that volatility has more history behind it. But Route B isn't impossible, especially if Debbie knows. Especially if there's one person in his life who sees all of it and doesn't flinch. Debbie is the most grounding force in Mark's world. She always has been. If she's looped in early, these on like even just the powers, not the mission, she becomes a stabilizing influence during all those years when Nolan is pulling Mark one direction and Mark's own instincts are pulling him another. So here's the honest answer to the section's question. Early powered Mark is probably physically stronger. He's probably more tactically prepared. He's probably better in a straight fight against most of the show's villains, but he's also more likely to be psychologically scarred in ways that Show Mark isn't. He carries more weight for longer with fewer safe places to put it down. Whether that makes him more dangerous or more vulnerable really depends on which version of that trauma he ends up carrying to the other side. Okay, we've walked through how early powers change the relationships, the training, the mission, the villains, and who Mark fundamentally is as a person. Now the big question, by the time we get to the show's major season 3 moments, does the ending actually change? Let's start with what stays the same, because some things are pretty fixed regardless of the timeline. Nolan's internal conflict resolves the same way. He can't kill his son. That's not a tactical decision, it's something in the bone. It doesn't matter how many years he's been running mission prep, or how many times he's told himself that the Empire's goals are bigger than personal attachment. When the moment comes, he stops. The show is built on that. It holds in any version of the timeline. Mark ends up opposing the Viltrumite Empire. His human half wins. That's the thesis of the whole show. And it doesn't change based on when his powers showed up. The question isn't whether he chooses humanity, it's whether that choice is easier or harder. Cecil's relationship with Mark stays complicated and transactional. That's just who Cecil is. He treats everyone that way. More time and more early contact doesn't suddenly make Cecil a warm person. If anything, a longer history between them just means more layers to the transactional dynamic, more things Cecil knows, more leverage on both sides. Now here's what probably changes. The emotional cost is higher for Mark in this version. He's been carrying this longer. The betrayal of finding out what Nolan really was, the mission, the lies, all of it, lands harder after a decade of their relationship being built specifically around shared powers and shared training. In the show, Mark's grief about Nolan is already almost unbearable to watch. In this version, it's worse, because Mark didn't just lose a dad, he lost the person who built him, the person who was his whole context for what he was. The human relationships that anchor show Mark, William, Amber, Eve, are likely thinner in this version, or more complicated, or both. Those friendships and that relationship exist in the show because Mark was a normal person when they started. Take away that normality and those connections form differently. They might still be there, but they're built on a different foundation, and foundations matter when things get hard. So here's the version of Mark we probably get at the end of season 3's story arc in this scenario. More powerful, more capable, more efficient in a fight, and more alone. With fewer people who knew him before the weight of all this settled in, and a longer history of carrying things he couldn't share, the most interesting irony in this whole scenario is this. By starting Mark's training earlier, by giving him more time to develop his Viltrumite capabilities, Nolan might have made him better at fighting the Viltrumite Empire, but worse to the thing that actually saves him, show Mark chooses humanity over Empire, partly because he got to live as human first, unguarded, ungoverned, just being a person among people for 17 years. That's not incidental, that's the whole foundation. It's why the choice feels real when he makes it, and why it costs something. Chip away at that foundation. Start the double life earlier, build the secret sooner, let the training shape him before the living does, and the choice gets harder, not impossible. Mark still makes it, but it doesn't come from the same deep, unambiguous place. Does Mark still become invincible? Yes. But invincible might mean something different in this version, less the name he chose to express who he already was, more the name he was always being built toward, the one that fits perfectly and feels at least a little like it was never really his to begin with. The show is really about one question underneath all the fighting and the secrets and the world-ending stakes. It's about what kind of person you become when the most powerful force in your life is asking you to be someone you're not. For Mark Grayson, getting his powers at 17 turned out to be something close to a gift. Not the powers themselves, those come with an impossible amount of weight, but the timing. 17 years of just being human, unguarded, building himself from the ground up before any of this arrived. That runway is what makes him Mark. It's what gives him the foundation to choose humanity when everything is pulling him the other way. Take that runway away, even partially, and the whole race looks different. There's a version of this conversation that goes way deeper. What does Debbie do with 10 more years of knowledge? What does a younger Cecil and Mark relationship actually look like as it develops? What happens to the other heroes in Mark's orbit if he's already capable when he first meets them? Maybe that's a follow-up video, honestly. For now, if you've made it this far, you clearly care about this show as much as I do. So drop a like and subscribe if you want more of these. And I genuinely want to know what you think in the comments.